Great to have you with us today, Majority Leader.
John, it's good to be with you again. Thanks for the invitation.
Let's get right to it if we can. Certainly big day Friday, big day Saturday, transportation compromise. Looks like it's a done deal. Just now awaiting on the governor's review and signature. I want to change, though, over to a second to Medicaid expansion. It's one of the things that some Democrats in the Senate were holding hostage. What is your approach now to Medicaid expansion in Virginia?
Yeah, and I think there's some real misunderstanding on the final language of the bill. I mean, first of all, a lot of your listeners know this, but Medicaid is about 21% of our current budget. 30 years ago it was 5%, so that's a 1,600% growth over those 30 years. It's just unsustainable. Basically what happened was the House had a position where we would not expand Medicaid until the legislature could come back next year and approve that. And, of course, you had to have all these reforms. The Senate had a position that basically you could reform at the same time you did expansion. And we thought you'll never get reforms if you do that. So the compromise was basically there's a whole list of reforms that you would have to basically do, and I can describe some of those later. And then there would be a commission made up of, and this is crucial, 5 House members and 5 Senate members, and they would look at all the reforms, and if they thought they'd been met, they could vote to expand Medicaid. But what everyone's missing is that it takes 3 out of the 5 House members and 3 out of the 5 Senate members to approve it. It's not a majority of the commission. And yesterday, Chairman Putney of House Appropriations appointed, frankly, and I totally agree with this, 5 hardliners on Medicaid reform who are going to look like a hawk at these various things. So this notion that Medicaid is going to be expanded, that a lot of the Democrats are saying, I just think is sort of a misnomer. And let me say one final thing is currently it's the governor's decision whether or not to expand Medicaid. And I think Governor McDonnell has been clear he's just not for that. But if a Terry McAuliffe becomes governor, I think it's probably fairly clear that he would expand it. This actually shifts that responsibility to this commission. So I could argue on one hand that, obviously it could even be a better firewall or backstop against Medicaid expansion.
So Majority Leader Cox, on Saturday, many Democrats in the state Senate were holding approval of the transportation compromise hostage to get the language they wanted for Medicaid expansion. They seem to be placated. Are you saying that they misinterpreted, that we're going to get bait and switch, or were they duped, or what?
No, not at all. I mean, I think we were very genuine. We basically talked about the commission. It was clear we argued very vehemently. It had to be 3 of 5 of both houses. And so I don't think that, that was that at all. I mean, I think they have been overselling for their audience what happened. And let me say this also, in the House, I think the Democrats voted for transportation anyway. I think and frankly, the two were delinked by everyone into the last day, and the Democrats conveniently linked them together, I think, to give them some cover on their, various votes. But I think my biggest fear was that we would not I think it's more realistic to say we would not have had a budget without that language. But I do think the Democrats have way oversold that language. If you look at that language carefully, it's up to that commission to determine that a whole list of very comprehensive reforms have been put forth. And let me remind you that the Obama administration, of course, has been totally uncooperative on these reforms up to Election Day, and then you're hearing somewhat about them being willing to do some of those. But my interpretation of this, they would have to do them all 100%, and then the commission could still decide, are they satisfied with that? And I think these 5 Republicans are going to take a very critical eye of whether or not that's actually occurred.
So let me ask you this, Majority Leader Cox. As far as the transportation compromise itself, Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, presumptive Republican nominee, opposed to this. How does this play out in the campaign where you got Bob McDonnell on one side, majority of the House and the Senate Republican leadership on McDonnell's side. Now you got the presumptive Republican nominee on the other side. How does this work out in the campaign wash?
Well, that's a great question, and probably have to be a political genius to figure that out. But I would say that probably, I'm not sure, John, that transportation is going to be a big issue in the campaign because, I mean, let's face it, the way life works, that, I mean, this pretty much, and you can argue it both ways, but this pretty much, if you look at the comprehensive agreement, really takes transportation to me off the table for 10 years. So as this campaign really goes on, I think you're going to see more of a discussion on issues that really are going to face the next General Assembly in the next 4 years. There'll certainly be some discussion of that, but I really feel like since that issue basically would be off the table really when the governor signs the bill, I'm not sure that's going to be the predominant issue. I think it's going to be much more, and I think this is a good thing, I think it's going to be much more, can we get real tax reform, which I know Attorney General Cuccinelli is very big on. And I think we'll get to conservative budgeting, how we basically, keep the general fund, which I think we've done a very good job at low levels. It really is probably around 2007 levels. So I really don't think that's going to be the center of discussion as I sort of read the tea leaves going forward.
What do you think of the fact that many conservatives have absolutely raked Bob McDonnell, yourself, Senator Tommy Norment, your Speaker Howe, raked them over the coals, saying that you guys sold out, voted for an expansion of government, you're not Republicans, you're really rhinos, you don't stand for anything. How do you respond to this onslaught of right-wing criticism?
Well, I think it's unfortunate for this reason. I mean, I'm the two-time chair of the Conservative Caucus, so, I have a 100% pro-life voting record, so I'm certainly come out of the conservative camp. And I think if you look at what we've done the last few years in budgeting, for example, this year we put $95 million additional money into the rainy day fund. We've done so many things. If you look at all the tax cuts that have come forth since I came forth, I simply made a judgment call that transportation had gotten so critical. We go up and visit the bond rating agencies in New York every year. I go up with the governor and several other people, and they always ask us three questions. Basically, tell us about your budgeting, tell us about that you're not expanding new programs, and tell us about transportation. And frankly, we never have an answer on transportation. And as they say, your ports, the way Northern Virginia works, you're simply not going to be able to sustain economic growth if you don't do something. And it came to that point. I think we have tried everything over the last 20 years, and if you look at it, I think it's the type of thing that will keep us in economic development and business where we need to be. Infrastructure is a core function of government. This is not, wasted Medicaid. This is not new programs. So it was necessary. It's certainly not something that I took joy on voting on, but it's just a necessary thing you have to do when you're trying to govern.
Majority Leader Cox, I would ask you, taking transportation off the table, are you particularly happy with what was accomplished in terms of the people's business here in this particular short session?
Steve, I couldn't have been more happy because, obviously controversy breeds headlines. Mm-hmm. But I know we had a lengthy conversation the last time we were showing on K-12, and could not have been a better year for K-12. Let me give you a quick example. We discussed this opportunity education institution that would basically help us with chronically failing schools. That actually did get funded in the budget. And I mentioned, obviously some other things, but let me just mention a small thing. A lot of people might not realize, we do obviously a lot of capital projects in Virginia, and these are college buildings. These are buildings for our mental health facilities, et cetera. We did something very similar about 3 years ago. Instead of publishing what we thought the building was going to cost, we put the buildings in sort of a pool. And what that meant was people had to bid on them and not really knowing what we thought our target price was. We have saved $122 million just doing that because with the great cost you're getting for construction now, they've come in way below cost. And so I'm very proud of our budgeting. We almost do no new initiatives, unlike the federal government. We'll have $700 million in the rainy day fund by the end of this biennium. So I'm very pleased with this session.
As it goes to that rainy day fund, as you call it, overall, what is the general fiscal health of the general fund now that we're tapping into that for transportation as well?
It's a great question. As you know, on the transportation plan, we thought general fund was absolutely essential. It's a core function of government. So it really amounts to about $200 million worth of general fund over 5 years. I think that is very sustainable because of what I just said. We've been very reluctant to put any new programs in. Even in K-12, quick example, I was a K-12 teacher for 30 years. The money's got to go in the classroom. We found out that our support personnel were growing much faster than our instructional personnel because there was no ratio cap. So we basically said for every 4 instructional personnel, we're going to have 1 support personnel, saved us $780 million. So I would say that the general fund in Virginia is in very good shape. And just a quick comment, because I think this is, a matter of semantics. Mm-hmm. Some people will tell you, you're not right. The budget's grown dramatically. No, the non-general fund portion has. And those are things like college tuition, et cetera, which, really the Board of Visitors do. And federal funds come through non-general funds. So if you look at what we really have responsibility over, which is general fund, we have really kept that under control.
And one more question before I hand you back to John, Majority Leader Cox. And again, we really appreciate you coming on, especially with all the people's business you had to deal with up to mid-afternoon on Saturday. I would ask you procedurally, as you come back for that one more day, the pickup game, so to speak, is there anything that's on the fence that's in danger of perhaps not getting through the full procedure after 30 days go by here that you really wanted to get through, or are most of the bills that passed safe at this point?
I think most of the bills that are passed are safe to this point. I mean, there's some tweaks I want to see. Mm-hmm. For example, there was $600,000 for the Opportunity Education Institution, which I think you really need to sort of implement, really reforming these schools that are chronically failing. We were only able to get $140,000 in the budget for that. Mm-hmm. So I would expect, things like that hopefully to be upped a little bit, just to be able to really, do that. But those are small things. I don't see anything really major on the horizon. We work pretty closely with the governor on a lot of this stuff, so I don't see, unlike previous years where you're right, there's this one major thing at the veto session that there's a big fight over. I'm sure something will arise, but there's nothing that's just obvious.
What about the A2F school grading scale? Were you, I know you were enthusiastically behind that. How does that stand now going forward, and how do we eventually get that done?
That actually did pass, and so I was very pleased with that. And I think there was a good compromise on that, because currently the way A through F would work is they're like 4 measures, but the major measure would be SOL scores, not just that. And I talked about this on the last show, that I really would like to see us also go to student growth measures, where you're measuring schools. If you're in a really hard-to-staff school in a tough area, I want to see that you're growing your students also. I think that should be a consideration. So there's a blending in the bill now of SOL scores and student growth, which I think is where we need to go to. I think you need to compensate teachers on student growth eventually, et cetera. So that is something that was sort of a tweak to the bill. I like that. But the bill got through sort of with that compromise sort of as is. So I think that will be a tremendous benefit to parents to be able to see exactly how their schools are performing in a understandable way.
Well, I'll tell you this, Majority Leader Cox, you're 2 for 2. We'll give you an A+ on this particular performance. Only your second one in for us, and I think you did terrific. Thank you again for the time.
Thank you, John, and please invite me back. I love doing it.
Our pleasure.